central growth team at Google. So our job is to work with all the different products and services that Google has and help them drive more growth for their products. I've had the good fortune to work on growth for a lot of different products at companies like Zynga and Facebook and a few dozen different products at Google as well. And I've learned a bunch of things along the way about how I can be more efficient and more effective by thinking about growth as a science. And that's what I'd like to share with you today. I'll start with this one statistic that always disturbs me. This comes out of Harvard Business School, and it's that 80% of new products fail. And what we mean by fail, or what this professor means by fail, is they perform far, far worse than what we expected them to do. Now, a lot of these products are good products. They do valuable, useful things. What that brings up is that just building and launching a valuable and useful product isn't enough to guarantee that it's going to land successfully. So, though there is definitely an art to building and launching products, my belief is that there's very much a science to making sure that it lands. And that's where growth comes in. To me, this is the most concise description of what I have been doing over the last 7 years or so in growth. It's really thinking about how we take the scientific method and apply it to moving a metric. And I'll get into more of what I mean by that, but what this has really done is gone from this notion, or what it's helped me do, is gone from this notion of let's see if we can growth hack our way into some things that may work, to actually using science as much as we can to drive growth in a reliable and consistent way. So if we just take a step back on the scientific method, it's been around hundreds of years, I think about 800 years, and it's more complicated than this, but basically these are the three main elements of it. If you remember back to like second grade when we were all learning about it, there's really three parts to it. The first part is you focus on observations of something you're trying to understand. The second part is you come up with hypotheses that explain what you just observed, and also hypotheses about how you might be able to change what you just observed. And then the third part is you run an experiment. Then there's that arrow going back, which is a very, very important part of the scientific method, because most experiments fail. You take what you learned from that failure and you adjust your hypotheses and try again. So that's the scientific method, and all we've done is take those same three steps, renamed one or two of them, but follow the same approach. This is what we're doing now with products, and this is what we did at Zynga, and this is what we did at Facebook, and this is what we're now doing at Google. The first thing we do is lots of analysis, lots of talking to users to understand something we're trying to figure out, which is what is making a particular product grow or not grow. Then we come up with some hypotheses that here are the key levers that are driving growth. And even more important, here's a hypothesis about we believe if we do this, we can move that lever. And then we run A/B tests. And I want to highlight this part of it because so many times you will go to a team and say, I think we need to improve X, or let's try Y. And they will say, we tried it, it didn't work. And if you dig a little deeper, what you'll find out is, yes, they tried it once and it didn't work. If they tried it once and it did work, then consider them very, very lucky and see if they can buy your next lottery ticket for you. But other than that, you have to go back. They never worked the first time. So that iteration part is an absolute critical part, and if there is one thing that I think has helped the teams just early on, it's what were some good ideas that didn't work, and you can revisit them. Yeah, they didn't work the very first time you tried it, but you never went back and tried again. All right, so let's dive into those three steps. There was the understand, this hypothesize, where we're identifying things that we think we can do to adjust what we observed, and then experiment. So this first part is understand. And we're trying to, again, take a really scientific approach here about moving things. So we're trying to figure out what are the main levers that we can move. What are the things historically that have driven growth for this product? And if it's a brand new product, then it's what do you believe are going to be the main levers? You came into building this product with the notion of here's how we're going to grow it. So start with those as your key growth levers. a little more detail on when I talk about a growth lever, what I really am referring to are it's things you can do or things you can optimize within the product or within your marketing campaign. So like an example of if you're YouTube, one of your growth levers may be that we see that the more people are subscribed to particular channels that they watch frequently, if we can actually encourage them to subscribe to those channels, that drives growth. We find that when we better optimize the recommendations for what video they should watch next, that also drives growth. So those are some growth levers. To be able to do this stage well, there's 3 things that we focus on. The first one, if you're going to do something scientific, that means it has to be experimentally measurable, which means you have to have a metric that you're trying to measure. Most of you have heard about the North Star metric. There were some things in the prior panel and prior talks where they mentioned if you focus on optimizing a metric instead of optimizing for the user, you're doing it the wrong way. I agree, but you cannot figure out how to optimize things unless you have a way to measure, did you actually optimize it? So the trick here, and you can see what I've got to the right of it, is when you come up with that metric, the metric should reflect and be as close a proxy as possible to this is delivering more value to the users. So when I was working at Facebook and we were with WhatsApp, we had acquired WhatsApp and I was working with the WhatsApp team as well on growth. I think a knee-jerk reaction would be, ooh, how many users per day are using WhatsApp? But what WhatsApp said is, yeah, but more users per day doesn't really drive growth for users. Users don't really care how many other users are using it. So for them, it was the number of messages sent, because that's what they do. They're a communications app. So the more communication that's going on, the more value they're delivering. Or in Google search. Again, not so much about the number of users who are doing a search every day. Yes, we do track that number, of course, but that's not necessarily the main thing that we're focusing on because that doesn't correlate directly with user value. A user querying something on Google search doesn't care how many other users are also querying different things. What they care about is the quality of search results. So we have this notion of search result quality as a North Star metric. The other thing is you can only pick one. You can change over time, but you can only have one at a time because everything else that I'm going to talk about is optimizing for that metric. So I think this is the critical step where you avoid just picking any metric and at all costs going forward and optimizing that metric without thinking about the user. The metric has to encapsulate user value. So after you have the North Star metric, there are a few tools that we use to help you more deterministically come up with where should you be focusing. Again, this is the step about identifying where the growth levers are. There are 2 main strategies that we use that will help us come up with what these levers are. And somebody earlier this morning talked about I think it was John Egan, who talked about the notion of having everything scribbled on a whiteboard and then people vote. This is my attempt to get rid of the variability of that semi-random approach because the results you get out of that approach will differ day by day. It will differ based on who's in the room and who voted. This approach should be the same. It's repeatable. You can argue that maybe some of the premises are fundamentally flawed, but if you can get people to at least agree on the premises, then the process itself is repeatable. It doesn't matter who runs it. So what we're doing here, user flow, walks through all the different stages that the user goes through as they're using your app. And there's 5 major sections to it. And this is a generic template that I give the teams for them to start working with. The red section down the middle is kind of the backbone. Those are the major stages that users go through. Acquisition, onboarding, whatever you may have, those are the main stages that they go through. On the left in blue is the area of how are we getting new users. The green areas are critical flows. They're really just expansions of when I talk about the onboarding stage, what are the steps to onboard them? Or the next one in this example, when I'm talking about the activation stage, what are the specific steps there? So that's giving me specific, more detailed flows, the green sections. The yellow section is what are those actions within the product that users do that are most highly correlated with engagement and retention. And it's correlation, not causation, but I'll start with correlation and then run tests to see if it's actually causal. So these are the key things that I would want users to do when they're in the app. And then the top right in the purple is, and how are we getting users to come back? What are the things we're doing to encourage them to come back, to offer them more value? So we look at this, and all those arrows you see there, we put numbers on, which represent basically just funnel flows. What percentage of the people go from the first box, if you pick any arrow, that go from the starting box to the finished box? And then we'll look through that, and whichever one has the lowest percentages of people completing those steps, since most of these are like the 5 critical ways. How do you get new users? How do you activate users? And how do you get them to come back again and be returning users? The things we find that have the most broken areas, that's one set of growth levers. So anything we find that's really bad shape, that's a growth lever. The other things that we'll find, so that's finding out where the leaks are, where things are broken. Usually in the yellow area, we're finding out what works really well, and those are the things that we will double down on. So this is a very methodical approach to figuring out what doesn't work, the lever, because we can fix it, and what does work, and that's a lever because we can double down on it. The second tool we use takes a different approach for finding levers. That one is about flows and where it's working and not working. This one is more of a functional approach to figuring out the growth levers. You start with, we call them internally growth models. You start with what is your North Star metric. In this case, it could be DAU, daily active users. And then you just start breaking it down. And I'll get into why we do that in a second, but let me just show you what I mean by breaking it down. So this is just one way to do it. There's anything that works for you and the team. It's really something that you guys feel comfortable with. But this is one way that I usually start if it's something about users, that the number of users I have today is the sum of new users plus returning users. Okay, great. So I've broken that down a little bit. I've got 2 inputs to that 1 output. Now I'll break down those inputs even further. So new users may be, and don't need to go through all of this here, but it's things like, okay, the people who visited the store from viral invites, plus the people who visited the store from ads, plus people who visited the store coming from some marketing campaign I ran, add those together, multiply that by the download conversion rate, and then multiply that by the activation and onboarding completion rate. And that's where my new users are coming from. And you can see something similar for returning users. So we just come up with something fairly simple. I will usually go 1 level deeper. So, okay, App Store visitors from viral invites. What's that a function of? And I'll usually stop about this level. My rule of thumb is we will write this out, and it should fit on a page and a half. When you're, like if you're looking at lines of code, it should fit on a page and a half of these little formulas. Any more than that, and you're kind of missing the point. What this is trying to do is not exactly model everything. It's trying to help you identify where levers are. And then what you do with this is you figure out which one of these, if I can increase some of these things in black, the things to the right of any of the equal signs, if I can improve each of them, say, by 5%, which ones have the biggest overall impact on daily active users? So it's essentially a sensitivity analysis. So that gives us a second set of growth levers we can focus on. And then ultimately what we're going to try and figure out is which of these growth levers are actually going to have the biggest impact by running through models like this. Again, all very simple. If you're spending more than a couple hours modeling it out, you're getting way too detailed and kind of missing the point. We will then have a list of which of these are the biggest levers that we want to focus on. So it's a very methodical and scientific approach here. Anyone can do this. It doesn't matter who's in the room and how loudly they can pound their fist on the table in terms of what they think we should be doing next. Then we get to that second phase of the growth process, which is identify. And the goal here is to come up with ways for how we move those levers. And for quite a long time, I've always wrestled with the notion of, yeah, but isn't this kind of an arbitrary process? It's you sit around and say, okay, well, we want to get more people to subscribe to channels in YouTube. Who's got ideas? So I'll, in a second, get to how we try and address that in a scientific way as well. But I wanted to make sure that as much as possible, we're getting the randomness out of the process. And by the way, something I might have added up front is I'm not at all saying that creativity is something that we should remove from the process. That's the focus of the core product team. They're going to be the ones who are coming up with the vision for where the product should be going, adding the new functionality. The growth team, my focus on what I want a growth team to do is take what the core product team has built and then figure out how to optimize it. So we're trying to come up with ideas on how to move these growth levers. The question is, well, wait a minute, are we trying to move the growth levers or are we trying to move the North Star metric? Why do we focus on the levers themselves versus just trying to see if we can measure movement in the North Star metric? The experiments we come up with are experiments to move the levers. Why not move the North Star metric directly? And the answer is fairly straightforward because it's really hard to do that. Most experiments we run, particularly if you want to do quick and easier experiments, are not going to have a big enough impact on your North Star metric. So then that leaves you stuck a little bit. And this is, again, when teams say we tried it, it didn't work. What they mean is we tried it and we couldn't measure any statistically significant difference in our North Star metric. So when you come up with levers, that solves the problem. And the way I think about it and the analogy I use to try to explain this is think about gears in a clock. If our North Star metric is the hour hand, I can stare at that hour hand for a while. I won't see it move. It is moving, we all know it's moving, but you're not going to really see it move. It moves pretty slowly, it's hard to move. But within the clock, there are other gears, like the second-hand gear. That's ultimately connected to that hour gear, but the second-hand gear is moving a lot faster. And since we're trying to use the scientific method here, which means we have to be able to measure a statistically significant difference in some metric, if all we can focus on is measuring our impact on the North Star metric, most of our experiments will have to be deemed failures because we won't see statistically significant differences. So instead, we move the growth levers, and we measure movement in the growth levers. And even though we see that the growth lever moved, but the North Star metric didn't move, it's like that hour hand. I know it is moving, even though I can't measure it right now. And if I just keep focusing on those smaller growth levers, and I do that enough times, I will see that hour hand move. So the other thing that we focus on in this identify phase, I said I wanted to get rid of the notion of who's got great ideas about experiments we can run. We know what we want users to do. We want them to click on an ad. We want them to use this feature. We want them to fill out this information in a form. We know what we want them to do. The question is, why would they want to do that? So this is where psychology comes in. And rather than saying, here's what I saw in a different product, can we turn to psychology to say, I know what I want them to do, what are motivations, what do we know about the science of psychology that will motivate someone to do what I think is optimal and is going to give them the most value. And what psychology will tell you is that this decision about whether I will or will not do something, we like to think it's logical. But it's not. The primary decision criteria that we use is emotional. We make the decision first emotionally, then we use logic to justify it afterwards. So we make decisions emotionally, and they are often very irrational. We make poor decisions. The thing that psychology will also tell you, and this is the field of behavioral science, is that these poor decisions, these irrational decisions, are highly predictable. So we do bad things in terms of decision making very predictably. And so if I know that, I can use that to guide people to kind of this decision framework where they can make good decisions. I know that when I present people with this kind of decision, they're going to make a bad decision. And they'll do it again and again. If I frame it this other way, they can make a better decision. So this is where we use the field of behavioral science and psychology to apply science to the process of, I'm trying to move a lever. What do we know? What can science tell us about good ways of doing that? And here's an example of that. This is from the Google Ads product. And when you're creating an ad, you can create as many variants of the ad as you want. It doesn't cost any more money. What we see when we run the analysis is that the optimal kind of knee in the curve in terms of ROIs, you need to run at least 3 or more variants of an ad, meaning just it's the same ad, just reword it different ways. Because the more variants we have, the more the ad engine can figure out which one is actually working the best for what types of users. The problem is, at the time, only about a quarter of advertisers had any more than a single variant of their ads, which means the engine can't really do its optimization work. So how do we get people? We know we want people to have 3 or more ads. So we put something like that in. We recommend you create at least 3 ads. And pretty much no one does it. But then we turn to behavioral science and psychology, and they tell us that there's this concept of goal gradient, this principle. And what it tells us is that when there is a multi-step process, we have this innate desire to finish a process we've started. So we change the UI to look something like this. So when you start, it says, great. We don't say you have to complete 3. It just becomes visually obvious that, okay, great. You're doing this one. The other 2 say pending. It went from about a quarter of the people doing anything more than 1 ad to now about 60% doing 3 or more, just by focusing on this notion of presenting it as a process and so on. So we did not come up with this randomly. This was relying on psychologists to come up with this. So the last step is the experiment and iterate. And the goal here is to iterate, iterate, iterate. The goal here is not actually just to test if it worked or not. The goal here is really to learn. And as an example here, this is real data from a product within Google where we were focusing on improving the conversion rate. And we can see we started at a little below 0.5% conversion rate. That was what we called round 0, which was the status quo. Then we had multiple rounds, and within each round, we had different experimental arms. And you can see that after the first round, this one actually, one of the 4 or 5 arms worked relatively well, and it got us to about 1%. That was considered a success for that arm, but even when we get a success, I urge you to not stop. Use that as your new baseline, and we went from, in 2 more rounds, which took about another month each, in 2 more rounds, we again doubled it before we ended up sort of plateauing and having to stop there. So you can see here, and I love showing this to teams that say, well, we tried it once and it didn't work. This is what happens even if it does work. You can keep learning, coming up with new baselines, and then coming up with hypotheses about how to further improve it. So this is the summary of everything we just talked about. This is what I present to teams that we start working with internally at Google, that this is the growth process. We covered all of these steps. That's it. That's all it is. It's a very simple but effective process that takes a lot of the variables out of the equation and lets you treat it a lot more like a science. And I've found this to be something that really has delivered consistent, reliable growth for the teams that use this. So those were the comments that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. Do you want to use this one?
Hello? Okay, great. So we're going to open up for a few questions before we head out to lunch break.
Hi. You mentioned in the slide with the little gear and the big gear that the big gear you may not see it move, but the little growth driver gear you can see that move. And I was wondering, you said even if you don't see that growth, that big gear move, there's this belief that if the little gear moves, the other one does. And I was wondering, how do you internally have those conversations? Maybe it goes back to that other slide where you broke down the formula, but how do you get buy-in on that? These are the correct little gears to look at, and that tie in that even if we don't see the big movement, that these things will eventually drive the big movement.
You sort of answered your own question. What we will do is go back to, if we can get people to buy in that growth model where you had the equations of this equals that plus this other thing times this other thing. If you can get people to buy into that, and that's usually not that hard. It's like, well, yeah, of course. It's people coming from these sources. They'll all go to the App Store, for example, and then it's the percentage of those people who land there that then download, and the percentage of those who then convert to becoming an activated user. Do you all buy into that? Most people think that that's fairly logical. And then I can say, so if I improve the percentage of people who go to the App Store page and increase the download rate, you would agree that that's going to be good. Yes, people would believe that. And I would say, but given the number of users we have every day already, And this is only going to be an incremental improvement on the new users, which is already incremental based on potentially a large user base if it's a product that's been around for a while. You can say, so the problem I'm going to have there is you're not going to see that move the daily active users or whatever the North Star metric may be. But it's not that hard to say, but you'd still agree it's a good thing. So as long as you can get people to buy into that model, the growth model, and then say we will determine whether we was good or bad based on whether we moved the growth lever, even if we can't see the North Star metric. The only leap of faith you're asking of them is, do you believe, though, that if we just keep moving all these easier to move growth levers, that the North Star metric itself will move? That's the only leap of faith we ask for, and it's usually not a very difficult one.
I guess the follow-up question to that is then, how do you prioritize internally the different growth levers among each other?
Well, that one, the key, I mentioned that you have to have a single growth lever. Sorry, I rephrase that. You have to have a single North Star metric, is to exactly answer that question. You then model out for each of these different growth levers, okay, if I can move this, do we believe we can move this by 5%? If so, let's say I can get a 5% increase in the number of people who land on the App Store page, to a 5% increase in those who that actually complete the download. I can just model that out. Well, what kind of traffic am I getting today? What's the current increase? And then I can model out, if I increase that by 5%, how many downloads do I get? What's the average retention 2 months later of a download, assuming that, that the people are, that incremental 5% are going to act like the prior group of people. That may be false, but it's a reasonable assumption to at least have a discussion around. And then you can say, well, overall, that should improve daily active users by X. Now let me do that for, what if I improve the click-through rate on notifications about something interesting that's just happened in the app to get people to come back? I can say that's going to have a much broader reach, but maybe a very tiny click-through rate improvement. I'll just model out which one has the biggest effect on the North Star metric. So it always comes down to, as long as we can agree on some assumptions, which are basically nailed down when you come up with the models in the first place, which one is going to have the biggest impact? And again, it gets rid of a lot of the debate. You do all the debating up front to come up with the metric and come up with the models. After that, it's a lot easier. All right.
Hello?
So embedded within this idea of the scientific method and running experiments is the ability to have a conclusive result, right? Like your experiment.
Have a what?
A conclusive result.
Yes.
So a statistically significant conclusive result. So my experiment did or didn't work, therefore I'll iterate on it. So what happens in a case where you have maybe a finite population and you know that with that sample size you can't get a conclusive result? You can get directionally what might be happening, but what is kind of the barrier between when you can conclude something and move to the next step versus say intuitively this looks like it's working, so let's move to the next step?
It's a great question, and I've been in analytics for a long time, and my view on analytics is that the value of analysts are not that they give you the right answer. The value of an analyst is that they give you an answer that's a hell of a lot better than randomly guessing. So given that, the gold standard is proving statistical significance. But if I don't have a population to do that, then, well, I could either randomly guess, or I can say, all right, it wasn't statistically significant, but I've run this 2 or 3 different ways, and the average moves up each time, not statistically significant, but it keeps moving up. At least I have some information, and statisticians in the room are, probably very upset with that comment, but what else are you going to do? It's either that or flip a coin. So I'll go with whatever data I can get my hands on. In general, though, what I try and do is, if I don't have a big enough population, I can usually make up for that and improve the power of the statistics by running the experiment for a longer amount of time. But sometimes you still can't do it.
All right, so I think there are probably some more questions, but we're running real short on time.
Okay.
We're going to have lunch in a second. Before that, I want to make sure we thank Ken here for his presentation.
Thank you all.